Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to another episode of the Ummah Times. And today we are very happy to have Brother David Livingstone back in our virtual studio. Assalamu alaikum, Brother David.
Alaikum salam.
Brother David needs no introduction. He is a researcher in the history of the occult. He's been a researcher for over 30 years. And today we're going to focus on one of his works, which I'm going to actually show. It's called Black Terror, White Soldiers, Islam, Fascism, and the New Age. And we're going to focus on certain sections dealing with how the influence of the occult had penetrated certain segments in Islamic civilization throughout history and modern history as well. Mm-hmm. So I want to ask all the viewers, kind of be patient. There's going to be a lot of very interesting material, revealing material that we'll be covering. So I do look forward to this fruitful discussion with Brother David. So Brother David, I'm gonna get right into it. We know each other very well, and I'm going to get started in from the start, like kind of like you can give us a little preview of the beginnings of certain movements that went away from Orthodox religion and start experimenting with, I guess, black magic, and how those certain groups and movements made their way into start making their way into certain segments of Islamic civilization. So I'm gonna let you get started on that, and yeah, you can take it away.
Okay. If you don't mind, I just want to have a little preamble, I think, to put everything in context. I was thinking about before we started. So, I think what can be considered to apply to the Islamic world, like it does to so much of the rest of the world, in terms of the manipulation, is what's called the Hegelian dialectic, right? So basically, like you look in the United States, everything is left and right, right? You got two parties you vote for. You're either liberal or conservative, and the debate is constantly stirred, aggravated, and without any opportunity for proper dialogue. And I think it's largely intentional. Both sides have a kernel of truth that they're layering with many lies. And the purpose ultimately is to bury that truth and to advance the lies. So in the Islamic world, we have something similar. Currently, we largely have a debate from my perspective, between Salafis and Sufis. Right? So it's basically one or the other. So the Salafis tend to be very literalist. And of course, they denounce the Sufis as heretics. And then on the other side, you have the Sufis, who are, because we have to remember that the point is that we're living in a time, especially since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, we're living in a day and age. This is really a tragedy, right? It's an exceptional situation that we haven't seen for 1,300 years. And it's a particularly dangerous tragedy, and I don't think Muslims really understand the gravity of it. So what happens in that case is then you don't have there's no political authority to protect Orthodox Islam. And so what happens, of course, in a case like that is I use the analogy of a gardener. If the garden disappears, then the weeds take over, and that's what we're looking at today. So
that's a good
analogy, all the weeds taking over, and overtaking basically the saner voices, and they are all advancing themselves. In fact, a lot of them are trying to put themselves forward as legitimate voices in this debate, with no discussion of what the true authority really is. So for 1,300 years up until that point, Muslim Islam, Sunni Islam, has always been divided into following one of the four madhabs. This has been truly key because it took years for that to take place. It took about 300 years, if I remember correctly, for the debate basically to advance to a point where most of the critical points had been thoroughly discussed. And this is something that Muslims are not used to today, of debating to a point where you achieve unanimous consensus, right? Everyone likes to throw out their point, call the other one a heretic or a kafir, and the discussion's over, right? That's not how things are done. So the point is that it took that long really to solidify the construction of Islamic law. And then it was decided that it was necessary to close the gates of Ijtihad because in order to no longer drag the Muslim population to further debate into too much detail. And then from that point forward to protect Islamic law and indirectly the community. So this is why for most of the time you have various voices, because what it's called is called taqleed, right? Basically, which is obeying effectively the authority of an expert. And so you have various voices coming along over time trying to challenge the gates of Ijtihad, and a very important one is Ibn Taymiyyah. So of course, the Salafis have used that as their weapon to attack Orthodox Islam. And the other side today, you have the Sufis, who are unfortunately pretty much the only voice that are calling for a return to what they call traditional Islam. So really, this is the debate that we're having today. And this is why, just like in American politics, you got these two competing voices, but no one representing the true Orthodox Islam. Instead, you have, they're tracking people into one or the other. So it's important to note, so that the book that you showed, it shows the occult influence behind both of those movements. So basically the occult, a very important cult tradition behind the founding of Salafism. And then secondly, that of modern Sufism as well, which is intricately embedded with the New World Order conspiracy in modern times.
So Brother David, I know in our last show, like you briefly mentioned Jamal Afghani and kind of the beginnings of a Freemason and a Muslim reformer / Muslim reformer. Now the thing is, when I heard that, I was taken aback, and because I was taken also back by you labeling him a Salafi, because before that I didn't read your book. And there are a lot of the Salafis today will say these guys were not Salafis, they were Kafir. And then they're and I'm just being open here. I know. and then calling Kafir, or at least deviants. Okay, deviants. Or I think Jamal Afghani, they call him a Kafir, I think. They call him a Kafir. And then calling the Muslim Brotherhood deviants. So when you were saying Muslim Brotherhood are Salafis, and you got Jamal Afghani a Salafi, and then you got the modern day Salafis, I couldn't wrap that around my head, because from my understanding is Salafis are different from the Muslim Brotherhood, and because the Salafis have been calling Muslim Brotherhood and Sayyid Qutb as deviants. Now, when I read your book and the research I was looking at, then I saw the connections you made between all these different quote unquote Salafi groups, and how there is a connection from the advent of these Muslim reformers like Muhammad Abdu and all that. So anyways, you can go on. Anyway, Brother Ali, if you want to jump in.
No, for sure. I mean, I think the research that you have put forward in the book, it's this for the lack of better words, it's mind-blowing, right? And you really I had to a couple of times reread the chapter to really make sense of it, because it's really a complex network. And before you cut out, David, I'll let you jump in. Obviously, if you could just for listeners and viewers, kind of just map it out in layman terms, exactly the emergence of these movements and how essentially in the back end they are embedded with each other.
That's
right.
Yeah. So I just want to give that preamble at first, because I didn't want, the tendency is to assume that I'm representing one camp or the other, right? And just like in American politics, I'm just showing I'm not left or right, and I'm not Sufi or Salafi, right? The point is, the truth is somewhere in between, somewhere. So the point is basically, the thing is they're all wayward, right? So this important with the point of the modern Saudi Salafis is that they're a little in between. The one they follow in particular is Rashid Rida. and they consider him not as misguided.
Mhm.
And that's to paraphrase an article that was written exactly to explain that point. So not as misguided. Because so Rashid Rida was the student of Muhammad Abdu. Muhammad Abdu was a student of Rashid Rida. And so Rashid Rida ended up in Saudi Arabia, and that's basically how the link with Salafism and Wahhabism basically began. So, to make a controversial point, basically to understand, I'm going to leap to another subject because this is where the core of it is that in Freemasonry, the whole legend of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, which is really the real core of Freemasonry, is that during the Crusades, so as Muslims likely know, in the late 1000s, the Christians gathered armies to go and conquer Jerusalem. After they did, an order was created called the Templars, Knights of the Temple. And they supposedly, according to Scottish Rite Freemasonry, came in contact with what are called in Masonic legends, the Eastern mystics. And they supposedly rescued a number of these mystics and brought them to Scotland, which is how you get the birth of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. So what this gets given birth in Scottish Rite Freemasonry, you'll notice that the Scottish Masons use the double-headed eagle as their logo, as their symbol. And what that's supposed to represent is what they call the emperors of East and West. And so what that means is that the West, of course, means the Templars, and the East means the Eastern mystics. And what they consider that to be is basically Kabbalists who had managed to, because they're Kabbalists who came to the West and developed the Western Kabbalistic tradition. Then there's Kabbalists in the East who created basically, the sort of Eastern portion of this tradition. What it goes back to is the belief that, presumably you've all heard of the Essenes. So the Essenes were famous in the beginning of the millennium, who were responsible in part for the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so the Essenes are very important in occult history because, they're considered to have basically given birth to a lot of the early occult doctrines. It's with the Essenes that you find the first examples of Kabbalistic literature. Very important in there is what they called apocalyptic literature. So various, writings about, expectations of the end times. So when you look at the writing of the book of Revelation, it's very much following in the tradition of the apocalyptic literature of the Essenes. The book of Revelation does not belong in the Bible. It is a book that was revealed not to Jesus, not to Paul, but to John. And it's apocalyptic revelation. This is why it was only entered into the New Testament around the year 400 AD, because it was so controversial. In fact, even when it was admitted, it was still with a lot of controversy. There were still a lot of Christian fathers who were opposed to its adoption into the Bible.
Was this prior to the Council of Nicaea or after?
After.
Oh, okay.
Long after, right? So almost nearly a century after. So the one of the main reasons why it was contested is because it was rumored to have been written by a Gnostic named Corinthus. And so when you read Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma, he begins by explaining that the entire mission of Freemasonry basically is to fulfill the book of Revelation, which is a Kabbalistic book. And he claims that Corinthus was the real author. So that's to give you an idea. So basically, going back to the Essenes now, a very important community. And so the legend is, so at that time, this is really, the birth of what they call the Western esoteric or occult tradition, particularly in the city of Alexandria. And this is where you get a confluence of a lot of the early occult influences, particularly Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, and the ancient mysteries, most importantly, the mysteries of Mithras, which influence the formation of Catholic Christianity. So basically, the Masonic history is that an Essene or the Essenes influence the Hermeticists. And then from there, a Hermetic tradition survived in the Middle East. And it's from that Essenic Hermetic tradition that the Templars came into contact with. There are various legends about who a particular person is, but I won't go into that. So, roundabout, the point is that when the Platonic Academy was closed down, I think it was Emperor Justinian, and I can't remember what year, 400, 500, somewhere around there. And of them, a number of them traveled to and settled in Harran, in southeastern Turkey, which becomes now the seat of the occult community in the Islamic world. So the city of Harran is basically the seat of a society, of a community called the Sabians, an occult, basically satanic worshiping, human sacrifice practicing cult called the Sabians.
So sorry, if I may pause here, Brother David. Do these Sabians have any relation to, because in your book you also talk about
the Sabians of the Quran,
the Ismailis, the assassins, right?
Yes.
Is there is a relationship with
direct?
Okay.
Direct relation.
Okay.
So the first point is that the Caliph Mamun, when he came to Harran, he gave the community there an ultimatum that they had to declare which people of the book they belonged to, or they'd have to pay jizya or fight. Right? So they got a few days to make a decision. They consulted their experts, and they were advised to call themselves Sabians, after the people from the Queen of Sheba, right? The true Sabians in the Quran, who are true legitimate people of the book. So this is how they appropriated the name Sabians, or misappropriated it. So they become now really the source of the entry of occult teachings, particularly Greek philosophy, in the Islamic world. And I don't have to tell you guys the impact that Greek philosophy has and the controversy that it's impacted in the Islamic world. Yeah. And so the Sabians now were through their by introducing alchemy, Neoplatonism, astrology, and all the classic occult practices, influenced an organization called the Brethren of Sincerity, or called in their full name in Arabic is Ikhwan al-Safa wa Khulnan al-Marwa. So they're typically called the Brethren of Sincerity, or the Brethren of Purity. And they wrote a number of epistles, what are called epistles, which basically all in out Kabbalistic and occult. It's called cult literature. So now the Brethren of Sincerity have an important impact on a branch of the Shia movement called the Ismailis. And of course, the Ismailis produce the movement of the assassins.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm gonna come in. If, you don't mind if I come in?
Of course not.
So this is very interesting because when I was reading history, it looks like what you're talking about. It looks like there were elements in the authority, at least in the Caliph authority, that they knew about the dangers of this group, and that's why they were operating underground. Because I understand the Caliph at that time, they were being they were being monitored, or they were being like, what do you call it, clamped down on. Yeah. So that's why they had to operate, underground and in secrecy. I mean, that's what I read. So yeah. It looks like what you're talking about is like some elements of it. They were aware of this, that these things were going on at that time as well. So.
Yeah, it's well known in the history of Islam as a batiniya.
Yeah.
So so basically you have the assassins, and so that's who the Templars apparently came into contact with, and that's how they learned their Eastern doctrines and brought them back to the East. So there's a number of important elements in the development. So the Brethren of Sincerity had a strong influence on Ibn Arabi. Ibn Arabi is key to understand the modern Sufi conspiracy, because he's really the one who inspired it, or they're all followers of Ibn Arabi. And so he was regarded as the Qutb, right, of his time. He was regarded as such by Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. So Jilani was founder of the Qadariya Sufis, who, of course, again, as well, is one of the most important components of the modern Sufi conspiracy. paradoxically, even though, of course, the Salafis are, harsh opponents of the Sufis, Ibn Taymiyyah himself called Al-Jilani Shaykhuna, our Shaykh. So Ibn Taymiyyah wasn't the anti-Sufi that he's made out to be. He was basically effectively a practitioner of Sufism. But what's also important is that Ibn Arabi was almost universally declared a heretic. And so basically, this is where we have these two channels kind of separate, right? So basically, Ibn Taymiyyah now is the one who develops this sort of anti-taqlid precedent in the Islamic world. He as well is denounced as a heretic. There's a great article, I think it's David Little, called Does Ibn Taymiyyah Have a Screw Loose? And he kind of collects a lot of the condemnations of Ibn Taymiyyah. One of the scholars that, there's various degrees of objectivity, but one scholar who universally denounced everybody, or both Sufis, Ibn Taymiyyah, was As-Subki, who's an interesting one. And he basically, declared.
And he's a well-known, high-caliber scholar. Like, I saw the fatwa of his regarding Ibn Taymiyyah. Now, this is quite. This is could be considered controversial, right?
Yeah.
Regarding Ibn Taymiyyah, because Ibn Taymiyyah is seen as a very high caliber. The Salafis call him Sheikh al-Islam, but even just generally speaking, Muslims in general, they put him on a high caliber.
Salafi influence.
Yeah. So I don't know.
It wasn't like that
I think things here get a little murky here because so the proponents of Ibn Taymiyyah say that his scholarly capability was so much that he can come up with rulings that might differ from
he could practice Ijtihad.
The schools of fiqh, the set schools of fiqh, right? And again, they would say that he did follow a school, which is the Hanbali school of thought, school of law.
Yeah.
But at the same, what got to me is the modern day. A lot of the modern day Salafis, they talk about how we got the right Aqidah, right? But when you look at the interpretation of the most important part of the Aqidah, which is the belief in God, belief in Allah, and based on the writings of Ibn Taymiyyah himself on the anthropomorphism of the Creator, that is totally,
it's clear.
It's totally that's totally wrong. And what, when you quoted scholars at that time saying that having that idea is kufr, which I actually agree with. I'm not saying Ibn Taymiyyah was like as a person was off, because as I said, we're not here to judge people. There's good and bad in everyone. We're talking about ideas here, and that idea is way off the true a true interpretation of Aqidah, of the most important part of Aqidah, which is in God, the belief in the concept of the Creator. So I say, like, where do they get off saying Aqidah, where the person you look up to had these anthropomorphic ideas of creation?
They're a British-funded sect.
But, anyways, go on. Yeah.
Right. They're a British-funded sect, the Salafis. Let's be clear, right? They're here to create fitna. They're here to divide the ummah, and ultimately to hijack it and turn us back to away from Allah. So what's curious is that again, this is a very important point of Ibn Taymiyyah's basically overt anthropomorphism, right? There's a famous story. A lot of people have denounced this, but I think it's Ibn Battuta, the traveler, when he saw Ibn Taymiyyah give a khutbah
in Damascus.
Ibn Taymiyyah descended the footsteps of the mimbar and declared that when Allah descends from the heaven, it's like this. It's been disputed, but there's enough other evidence to prove that he wasn't anthropomorphic. So what's interesting is that Harran is the seat, or the Sabians were the key preservers of an anthropomorphic doctrine, which is a Kabbalistic doctrine. So, so when I'm going to backtrack, but this is a really important point. Right? So, when you look at the history of Kabbalah, it begins with the Essenes, as I mentioned, and then with the Roman conquest of Israel and the destruction of Jerusalem. That's the end of the Jewish community and the beginning of the diaspora. And so for about 1,000 years from that point until the birth of Kabbalah in the late 1100s, scholars are trying to figure out, where did they come from? And so the leading scholar of Kabbalah in the 20th century, the guy who basically founded the study of modern scholarly study of Kabbalah, is Gershom Scholem. You have others today like Joseph Dan and Moshe Dell. Another one is Nathaniel Deutsch. And they all explore the same question. Gershom Scholem devoted a whole book, The Origins of Kabbalah, to try to figure it out. How do doctrines that had been considered heretical and effectively disappeared for 1,000 years from Judaism, all of a sudden make their appearance in the late 1100s to form, what's called a medieval Kabbalah. And so most of them agree that the one possible means of transition of these ideas is the Sabians, or also called the Mandaeans of Harran. And the reason for it is because of their adherence to an anthropomorphic doctrine. It's known in Kabbalah. So in Kabbalah, the early Kabbalah, there's two aspects of it which are really important. One is Merkaba, and the other one is Shir Koma. And Shir Koma is basically literature devoted to descriptions of God's body. Right? And so I'm not making any particular claims, but I'm suggesting it's a surprising coincidence that Ibn Taymiyyah comes from Harran and happens, of all people, to spread an anthropomorphic doctrine, which unfortunately has been since adopted by the Salafis and advanced by them.
Mm-hmm. And before we go on and how that kind of, in terms of the present day Salafi movements, like how that helped pave the way for that and reemergence of it after the fall of the Ottoman state, the Ottoman Empire. I want to talk a little bit about Sufism, because this is just like my cursory understanding of what's happening here. Like anthropomorphism, because I read about that really despicable person, one of the most despicable person probably was ever been on this earth, that guy Aleister Crowley.
Right.
Yeah, all these Satanists, they anthropomorphize their deity. It's a pattern I see, right?
Exactly.
And it looks like this acceptance of this anthropomorphism got into some segments in I guess among some Muslims in their understanding of Aqidah. But then the Sufis, it's very interesting. Sufis they call this maqam. They have these maqams, right? They call it maqam. They have these levels, and it's just like they're trying to be God themselves, right? Or like, and Aleister Crowley said that the ultimate law is to do what as you will. So basically, you become, or you are God himself, like the God man himself. So, anyways, if you can talk about a little bit about how Sufism kind of penetrated, and how it got, like Salafism has an acceptance today, now has same as Sufism, it's gone some sort of acceptance as well, right?
So there's a lot of interesting parallels. Like basically, Abdul Qadir Jilani was known as the Rose of Baghdad, and so he's considered to be one of the possible sources of the rose symbolism that was adopted in not only Kabbalah but ultimately in the founding of the Rosicrucian movement. Because according to the first Rosicrucian text, it's based on the legends of a man named Christian Rosenkreutz. and he travels to the Middle East to learn magic and Kabbalah. And they also, of course, the Sufis claim to have made contact with Al-Khidr, who is a real figure in the Quran. But their version of him is basically an assimilation of the worship of Elijah amongst the Jews and Saint George amongst the Christians. And so Saint George is a saint, an early, I think, 4th, 5th century saint who apparently killed a dragon. And it's a well-known fact that he's from part of the world where that legend had long been associated with the cult of Dionysus. And it's basically an old Babylonian legend of the god fighting the dragon. So this is how that legend, so Saint George became the patron saint of the Templars. He became the patron saint of the Order of the Garter and of the Order of the Dragon. So all these orders are really kind of the underlying, satanic orders behind the preservation of occultism in Europe. And most of those societies, their influence basically led to the founding of the Rosicrucian movement. Rosicrucian movement were responsible for, as well known, developed into Freemasonry, which was linked to the Illuminati and so on and so forth. So to jump ahead, in the 1800s, there was beginning in the 1700s, there was a goal to try to destroy the Ottoman Empire, right? So the British power was expanding in the world. They managed basically to begin colonization of India, but the Ottoman Empire was in their way. So to do that, they needed to somehow, their classic divide and conquer strategy. They wanted to pit the Arabs against the Turks. But how do you pit brother against brother? So the only way you can do that is by causing one to denounce the other as a heretic, not as a kafir. So this is how you explain now the advent of Abdul Wahhab, Ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder of Wahhabism. What's interesting is I wrote an article about this, but in 2009, Iraqi intelligence had actually produced an article about the Jewish origins of the Wahhabi movement. And they trace in various ways the Jewish origin, particularly Sabbatian origin of both Ibn Abdul Wahhab and Ibn Saud. So what's important, I talked about the Rosicrucian movement was responsible also for the mission of Shabbatai Zavi. Shabbatai Zavi was a Jewish heretic who declared himself Messiah in the year 1666. And that has a whole lot of, they derive the significance of 1666 from the Book of Revelation. That's a whole other story. So this movement basically, what happened is that half of the world's Jewish population was convinced to follow him until he converted to Islam. So most of the movement was disappointed, but some of them remained followers. So there's a number of them who basically migrated, became influential, particularly in Poland, where they were followers of Jacob Frank, and they were linked to the founding of the Illuminati. In Turkey, they continued to be known as Domni. So the claim is from the the Iraqi intel document, from their research is that Ibn Saud and Abdul Wahhab were descendants of Domni. So what does Ibn Wahhab do? He resurrects the notions of Ibn Taymiyyah that it's possible to reject a taqlid. And so this is how he begins to find justification.
So I'm going to just pause here. So now this is very interesting because since childhood, when we've learned about the scholars and especially Ibn Taymiyyah, our impression has always been that he has been one of the jewels of Islamic scholars throughout. So when you say that before Ibn Abdul Wahhab, he was someone who was marginal, and it was because of Ibn Abdul Wahhab and his movement that brought him up, again. That's kind of revealing. It is I think for many people, we were revealing that he was considered marginal. He was marginal at that time. He was marginalized at that time,
Mhm.
but because I think, and as he said, like, and it's this is based on your research on the section on the petrodollar Islam, is that they've
Right.
really kind of schooled a lot of the Muslims in the world
Absolutely.
on our take and on view,
Yeah.
I guess on Islamic history, right?
And Islamic law, most
Yeah,
importantly.
and
That's what they're
Islamic
trying to do.
law,
Right.
That's, yeah,
Right.
definitely.
Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to undermine, they're trying to reopen the doors of Ijtihad. That's the point.
Yeah.
Now, forget everything else. That's the main mission, right? It's the only way they can. This is why the doors of Ijtihad is what protected us until that point, which is why the only way to penetrate Islam was to reopen the doors. This is the British strategy. How do they rewrite an Islam to make it susceptible to their agenda? The only way is to reopen. The only way is to discredit the importance of taqlid and the four madhabs, and that's the plan.
So so Salafis, especially the contemporary Salafis, sometimes they also come up with the idea that, well, Abdul ibn Wahhab, that the way he did things was basically to emphasize obviously on Tawheed. And during the Ottoman Empire, there was the worshipping of the Sufi shrines and all that stuff, all the quote unquote bid'ah was widespread, and he was basically trying to cleanse the land. So in that sense, as somebody, as a neutral person, like, yes, you have one extreme over here where he's declaring everybody kafir or on bid'ah, but at the same time you also have Ottoman Empire, which is supposed to be serving the orthodoxy, Sunni orthodoxy view of the world, but at the same time they are letting all these malpractices be prevalent throughout the society. So how do you go on?
That's why I started with my preamble.
Yeah,
right. It's a dialectic.
It makes complete sense. Yeah,
Sufis against Salafis. That's why exactly why I stated like that, because that's the way they misrepresent. It's like the Russians and the Soviets, right? They both Russians and Americans, they both expose truths about each other so that they can gain credibility and advance their own particular agenda. So it's the same thing. That's exactly what they're doing. That's why they're posing it's one or the other. It's not one or the other.
Yeah.
It does make sense. It does make sense. And you know what? And when I was reading your newly revised section on Sufism, what was surprising, just like what you wrote on the Salafism and its connection to Freemasonry and it's giving us a kind of false view on bypassing the juristic schools of law, is like you said, that the certain Sufis, they're great critics on Salafis when they say they bypass the four schools of law, but they've accepted, they've embraced the dubiousness of Sufism, and they have these dubious connections with pedophiles. It's crazy, and then and I'm gonna just cut to the chase. Like my take of what your take is, Brother David, is that that Islam is based on the set juristic schools of law, minus the Sufism and Salafism, and there's, I don't know of any, and I was talking to Ali about this. I don't know of any, like, there are individuals who may know this and may practice this, but I don't know of any international organizations who proclaim this. So if there's any international Islamic organizations, they proclaim this, but they embrace Sufism, or there might be international organizations that bypass it or don't give importance to the juristic schools of law, but they're steeped into this Salafist view of Islam, very rigid, where they're right and everyone is actually deviance, right? So is my assessment or observation right here?
Absolutely. The Prophet said, right, he said, that I can't remember exactly the details of the hadith, right? But basically, what do you do in times of, great fitna is you stick to the group and their leader. What do you do if there's no leader? Stay away from everybody.
Yeah.
And hold on
Right.
to I guess I guess keep
the
on
roots of
biting
the
onto
teeth or, yeah.
the root of
Right.
the tree or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I actually, you quoted that hadith in the book,
Right.
and which is actually was instructive. Like, at least it was for me instructive, right?
Yeah.
Like, what you need to do is just try to hold your own,
Right.
to try to kind of filter the truth.
That's why I say, like, I use the analogy of the gardener, right? If the gardener's
Yeah.
gone, the weeds take
Eh, eh,
over. What you're talking about is the weeds.
Yeah,
Where those
and you
weeds
know,
take over, and who's the leader? You can't
Yeah.
tell who's in
So I
charge.
want to, yeah, I want to actually a little bit talk, because I think that analogy really, fits our present day situation. So how do we, bring that gardener back?
So that's the point. So this thing is that we first need to identify. The Prophet said, he doesn't take away knowledge; he takes away the knowledgeable. That's the situation that we're living in. The truth is there. It's the books are all there. They're all in the libraries, mostly at McGill and Harvard, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But there's no scholars you can go to ask a proper legal opinion. Unfortunately, there's a lot of traditional scholars still existing in places like Mauritania or Syria. Al-Bouti was a famous one, but Al-Bouti is part of the crew. These are all guys who are, so it's the same. If they are advancing the truth, they're bought out. If they're not advancing the truth, they're part of the, some kind of other agenda, right? So the thing is this is why I'm writing my books, right? Ideally we need to pull away the lies so we can get the truth. See, now, if we discover that this is the true Islam, we need to work on reviving it. It's going to take some time, right? You can't just overnight. We're going to need to, again, build scholars. Like, again, the Quran says, some of you stay behind. When others go to fight, some of you stay behind to learn, to teach the others when they come back. There always needs to be a group that are devoted to the study of the law, so that basis develops, so that we have something to be guided by.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to. The thing is, and the problem with the Salafi movement is that they created so much literature, and they created this impression that everybody's got to be an alim, basically, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't work like that. There are because basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to re-educate you on the basics. Mm-hmm. Right? It's one thing if you're looking to how you're supposed to pray and eat and buy a house and things like that. Basic legal questions, but what they're trying to do is fill you in. You look at what's his name, Bilal Phillips. I always remember reading his book on Tawheed, right? It's a classic example. One of the main things that he teaches is that God can't be in the bathroom. Mm-hmm. Right? So God has got to be above, which is a classic, Salafi anthropomorphic doctrine. As you know, as I wrote, I quote in my book, is that God is formless, without direction or place.
Yeah, and that was a standard understanding prior to Ibn Taymiyyah, that he when he introduced these anthropomorphic ideas. I want to talk a little bit about this. It's a very good topic that Brother Ali and you were talking about, because I can't speak for Brother Ali, but when I was growing up, I read Bilal Phillips' books. I read his teachings and understandings of Islam,
Mm-hmm.
and yes, the impression was that if you have this idea of where you follow the 4 schools of law,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what Islam is, you're being dogmatic.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying Bilal Phillips came across he wasn't, maybe he's explicit, but he was
Saudi educated.
Yeah. So he was like, the book I read, what he's implying is that if you kind of limit yourself to the understanding of the 4 schools of law, then you're anti-reason, which actually. So that's like I bought into that when I was growing up, and then later on, with some of the research that you've done and start reflecting on it. You know what? I was just talking to, again, I mentioned this to Ali. No two person will agree with each other ever, right? So even within these schools of law, you have scholars who may differ with each other, but there's a process.
Right.
There's a process.
Right.
So in one school of law, in the Hanefi school of law, you have scholars, they might have disagreements, but there's a process where they get to those disagreements and they tolerate each other.
The tolerance is different.
And not only that, they tolerate the rulings of the other school of law as fellow Muslims.
Right.
Yeah.
And I understand that, okay, the closing of Ijtihad is not closing of reason, it's the closing of making it harder for another person to open up another
new
school of
school.
law. That's
Exactly.
basically what it is, right? Because
Exactly.
you can't go forever there. And and if you look, and in any tradition, even in the Western tradition, you have 5 schools of law. Why did they limit to 5 schools of law? Because because if you keep on going, how are you going to have a functioning legal system?
Bicker forever.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's actually rational that
It is.
you set it to a 4 schools of law. And it makes it hard, and it'll make it hard for anyone who wants to create another school of law. That's what the closing of Ijtihad means. That doesn't mean the closing of reason. And prime example is Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd is in the West. He's considered a Muslim philosopher, but he was a jurist. He was a Maliki Fiqh scholar, right? And he wrote the book on the primer on the various schools of law, right? And he's considered a prime proponent of reason. So we just want to clear that misconception that this idea of Islam being based on the 4 jurisdictive schools of law is not anti-reason. It's actually rational if you reflect on it.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's the thing, is that Muslims, that was what Muslims followed logically for 1300 years until Ibn Taymiyyah. These excuses that they provide is just propaganda, and they got away with it because Muslims were ignorant.
Yeah. And I think a lot of these, and what's ironic about all of this is that, these contemporary Salafis, they base their argument on Salafism, which is basically going back to the earliest generations, right? Yeah. And to basically really, portray their view of Islam as orthodox version. And what's interesting is that the very elements that depend on, for example, Bilal, you don't really have to follow the 4 madahib. You can, focus on doing your own thing, is very much in tune with the secularism, right? And the modern, way of thinking, where you have access to knowledge as humans, right? Everybody should be equal. And you can just go on the internet, as an example nowadays, and Google, whatever hadith you need to, and try to apply it to the best of your ability, right? So you basically, everyone is, is issuing a fatwa for themselves. Right.
Exactly.
So it's kind of like, it's ironic, you're trying to, go back to the earliest, but at the same time, you are very much in tune with the modern way of thinking, how the contemporary worldview has developed over the past 200 or 300 years. So that's quite interesting.
As they say, devils are in the details. So the rigorous scholarship that took place within these schools, they dealt with the details, right? Which was needed. And you can't go, you can't bypass the schools of law and just go right to yourself, because there's so much material out there as a legal jurist you have to go through to make the rulings, right?
Right.
So
there's a point.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's a great point made by Imam Nawawi. So the Salafis love to quote, I think it's Imam Shafi, who said, if you find a hadith that contradicts my ruling, follow the hadith. But Imam Nawawi is like, Imam Nawawi didn't. Sorry, it's funny, but he didn't mean just like, you see the hadith and then you change the law. He meant, you have to know exactly how Imam Shafi came to that ruling. Why did he abrogate it? Was he aware of it? What basis did he use? Basically, you got to be a scholar on his standard to prove why he would have disregarded that hadith, and then you can follow his ruling.
Right.
Anyway, it's just a classic example of the kind of, sneaky, twisted logic, if you wanted to call it, that the Salafis are using. And let's say it's the British have been using how the British have been using the Salafis to undermine Islam.
Yeah. I mean, just to also kind of we're getting close to the end of the podcast now, that kind of going back to the analogy of the garden that you used earlier on. So I know we spoke about it. Obviously, we have to, get to the bottom of the truth and everything else. But now, with all these especially when we read your book, it's just mind-boggling how we're living in such a dark web, right? So it's not feasible for an average Muslim to go through all this. The best we can do obviously is that promote this research, so a lot of people look into it and try to educate themselves. But I mean, as I'm trying to obviously be more optimistic than pessimistic, more like looking at the half glass full versus half glass empty. But it's how do we get out of this? Like it seems almost impossible. For example, if even on a human level, even on a small little on a family level, you want to make some changes, you're going to have a lot of obstructions. At the same time, societies are obviously built on the bigger structures where all these ideologies are kind of pushed down from top to bottom. How do we really make sense of all this?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing is everything is a test from Allah. And Allah puts us in situations where we get to the point where we wonder how we're going to get out of it. Right? And because the lesson always is that there is no hope except through him. Right? So even if these characters have got every weapon in the world, all the nuclear power, all the wealth, it might seem insurmountable. The reality is Allah is just waiting for us to ask, right? Because he is a power that dwarfs anything that these guys could ever amass. So that's the main point. We always have to remember, always have to keep hope, right? But I think the simple point is that the orthodoxy of following a madhab, because that's the kind of logic that I went through, right? Because I first read Bilal Phillips's Tawheed when I first came to Islam, and that's how I was so ignorant, I had no idea. He basically said how the multiple madhabs were causing confusion, so Ibn Wahab came in, simplified things, subhanAllah, and so I kind of just almost automatically accepted it as reasonable. So when I discovered that the Salafis were wayward, it took me a while to figure out what's the truth. So I was trying to find, what group and who to follow, what sheikh, what's this, what that, until I finally realized that it was there all along. And that's the simple fact is that, if Muslims want to know what it is to be a Sunni, it's right there. It's always been known.
And right? if I may interject, that is like it's a kind of like a cognitive dissonance that people are practicing when they say, oh, it's not, because they're practicing it. So for example, the way we pray, we're actually practicing.
Yeah, exactly.
But that school of law rigorously researched on and concluded on that this is the way to pray in terms of the way you pray your salah, how many which are obligatory, which are not. We're already like I mean like that. Yeah, like actually, yeah, I'm following the Hanafi way because I'm praying the Hanafi way, right? But even though they were practicing, they don't give it importance. If it wasn't for them, if you think about it, these scholars, they rigorously went through the Quran and Sunnah to come to these conclusion ruling to better Muslims, right? To better them in their worship of the Creator.
Correct.
We are indebted to them. If it wasn't for them, do you ever hear in Christianity that there's been some tradition of Christian scholars on how to exactly pray, and this is what's been left for them? There's no such thing as Christian schools of law like that I've heard of.
I think it's probably the world's greatest legacy. I think the period of scholarship is the most superior intellectual exercise of human history, in my humble opinion. You look at the science that the Muslims did was exceptional, but if you look at the Greek period, the Renaissance or the Scholastic period in Europe, nothing comes close to the quality of scholarship that was produced to shape the Islamic system. The logic, this very strict logic that they follow. The
whole logical and rational idea of the Creator, and how, and it gave Muslims flexibility and tolerance of your fellow Muslims as well. Like it embedded in it. It made it law. It made it set. right? You cannot go beyond this. And talk about them being anti-reason. Abu Hanifa used to debate publicly with atheists, right? That was a dynamic time. Like this is what he calls true scholarship, right? Right. So, and yeah, and it's I think this is something I think the viewers should kind of think about, is kind of look at, Islam being based on the jurisprudence that was kind of worked on and set, minus the Sufism and Salafism. I know this might seem controversial, but this is something I think our viewers need to reflect on in these crazy times we're living in, right? So
I think, if Ibn Wahhab was honest, then what he would have done is he would have engaged the Islamic community in a debate, and he would have waited until a unanimous opinion was arrived at. That's the normal way that, because if he was correct, he should have been able to bring the four schools to agree on his points.
I'm going to go.
So the fact that he didn't means that he created a sect.
Yeah,
I'm going to go just a little back in history, because I'm very curious when this whole the schools of law and their whole process, was a lot of it destroyed when the Mongol invasion, or were they still continuing after the Mongol invasion, or did the destruction of the scholarship traditions, did it really end when the Ottoman Empire got destroyed? Because wasn't that a big dent when the Mongol invasion, where they killed the Abbasid Caliphate? Abbasid Caliphate, wasn't that a big dent?
But that would have been the end of the Abbasid Caliphate.
Yeah.
So basically, the replacement was the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
And so the Ottoman Empire is actually unique, because the Ottoman Empire was actually the first empire. Even though the Abbasid was Muslim and the schools developed within the Abbasid Empire, it didn't really conform to Islamic law. The Ottoman Empire was the first attempt to rule according to Islamic law.
Yeah, because they picked one school of law, I believe the Hanafi school of law, to rule with.
It was more codified, yeah.
It was more codified. Yeah. But what happened was, I think the internal destruction took place when they accepted the Tanzimat reforms.
Tanzimat, of course.
The secularization of the Ottoman state. That's where it went down. And I did some readings. It was influenced by Freemasons, right? This Ottoman diplomat was living in Europe. Yeah. He became a Freemason. He came back and he brought the ideas of the Tanzimat reforms.
Right.
And it was downhill from there.
By the Donmei who were secret Sabbatians.
Yeah.
Right. Working with them was Afghani.
We also want this for our benefit of our viewers, because most of our viewers are Muslims. We want to put this in the Quranic context as well. Is that, and you can add to this, Brother David, because in the Quran, it makes it clear, like the shaitan and its allies are always plotting, always conspiring, no matter what. And I think a lot of Muslims cannot wrap their heads around this, and they'll immediately call us conspiracy theorists because we're talking about these kind of topics. If you could kind of just kind of talk about on the Islamic perspective on this, and how this is what it is. This is what reality is, right?
Yeah.
The reality is not black and white. Absolutely not.
No. I mean, my favorite, one of my favorite verses in the Quran talks about how on the day of judgment, the elite and the masses, that's the way I translate the terms, but it says basically the ones who are powerful and the ones who are weak. So the elite and the masses are throwing accusations against each other. And the elite are like we were just as lost as you were, and the masses complain that no, it was a conspiracy. And I wish the proper term had been used in the translations, but they call it plotting, right? But it's conspiracy. The masses say it was a conspiracy that you carried out day and night to try to delude us, right? Yeah. And basically, in the end, Allah says, you both are condemned. So it's important to remember that, it kind of brings back the point. It's not about accusing anybody in particular, right? Both are condemned, the deceived and the deceivers. So we have to be careful that, we don't get deluded by these plots. And obviously, as well, the Quran says that Iblis is an aduwwun mubin, right? A devoted, concerted enemy. Mm-hmm. We should never underestimate the lengths that he's willing to go to. This, and I keep saying, like this creation is not a joke, right? Allah didn't create this as a joke. This is for real. This is life and death situation we're in here. We're in a battle for our souls, each of one individually. So we can't take this life lightheartedly. We got to understand that, there's a concerted effort to try to do everything possible to get us off the right track.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the nature of the world, right? Because our real home is the akhirah. So I think people have to realize the nature of the world is this battle between real forces of evil and good. And especially for the Muslims, where we don't have the gardener to take care of the garden, we're more vulnerable, and we should be more skeptical, of everyone, but especially the people who don't call themselves Muslims, and we take whatever they give us as hook, line, and sinker, right? So,
yeah.
So we need to, especially now, keep our thinking caps on and filtering out the things that we're dealing with, and try to live as close as possible to what is true, right? But
Exactly.
It was a pleasure, Brother Ali. Anything you'd like to add? I think we covered a lot in this. I think even though in a short span of time, we covered some very salient points, important points in this. And I hope the viewers take some time, don't write us off, take some time to reflect on what's been said. We will outline all the references on any controversial points we made. We're not talking, out of thin air or anything like that. We're talking about research that Brother David has done, and everything is kind of evidence and referenced. So, Jazakallah khair for that, Brother David.
Thank you.
And Jazakallah khair for everyone for listening. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.